here we go with the QR code again. Told you you'd see that a few times today. But if you want CLE,
I have to do that.
Follow the QR code. We start off with a panel on AI issues relating to the space industry, and I want to introduce our moderator for this. We'll introduce the panel, but the moderator is Quincy Stott, who is the General Counsel of Maxar Space. Take it away, Quincy.
Thank you, Skip. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for making it back from lunch. This is a highlight of the law and regulation track today, so we're glad you're here. The topic is AI issues relating to space. So we're going to dive right into it. Let me introduce our terrific panelists here. First of all, to my left, your right, is Kim Crider. Kim is a founding partner of Elara Nova, the space consultancy. She provides strategic consulting advice and support to commercial solutions providers, investors, and governments on how to bring advanced space capabilities to bear. A retired Major General, Kim had a 35-year career in the Air Force and Space Force as a seminal leader in cybersecurity, data integration, and AI. She was the first Department of the Air Force Chief Data Officer and the first Chief Technology and Innovation Officer for the United States Space Force. Next, at the end of the table, is Tuana Yazici. Tuana is a third-year law student at the University of Miami School of Law, class of 2025. She's actively preparing for the bar exam right now. So good luck, Tuana. We're excited for you. Tuana is also the founder and CEO of the holding company Tuana Group and its subsidiaries Aero AI Voyages and Aero AI Design Lab, and the nonprofit Aero AI Global Solutions. Together, these entities leverage space technologies and AI for humanitarian purposes. And then last but not least, Matt Linton, in the middle of the panel here, is the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel at True Anomaly. Previously, Matt was the Associate General Counsel for Operations at Lockheed Martin Space. He was in private practice with 2 national law firms and in government practice with the U.S. Department of Labor for over a decade. And Matt also started his legal career as an appellate law clerk for Chief Justice Mary Malarkey of the Colorado Supreme Court. Let's now go to Tuana. Tuana, you recently completed a very important project with the International Institute of Space Law, one of today's co-founders, examining the legal and regulatory landscape related to AI in space. What would you like us to understand from all that work you did? You and the team, I suppose I should say.
Thank you all for coming to our panel discussion today. As the chair of the International Institute of Space Law's working group on legal aspects of AI in space, I'm very proud to share our published report with you today. And it's called Balancing Innovation and Responsibility, International Recommendations for AI Regulation in Space. So this was a huge collaborative effort, and I would first like to thank the International Institute of Space Law and the President Kai Vogel for giving us the support. So this 267-page report was completed in just 6 months, and we presented our preliminary findings at the IAC in Milan, and then briefed the European Space Operations Center and also the International Telecommunication Union BR Director and his team. And I will also present to the UN Legal Subcommittee in May. So this report, it examines international law, soft law, regulatory frameworks like GDPR, procurement, export controls, telecommunications, and also explores ethic case studies like genetics and robotics like border control and lethal autonomous weapon systems, environmental considerations, everyone's favorite topic, space traffic management, and air and maritime law. I'll just start reading from page 1. No, I'm just kidding. Imagine. But I have been giving an impossible task today to go over this in 15 minutes for you all, so I'll highlight just key points for you. So, as I mentioned, we presented this at the IAC, and we had the opportunity to discuss also with government officials, industry leaders, academics, and then we came up with both short and long-term actionable recommendations supporting responsible innovation. So let's start with international laws and treaties. And due to time today, I will only focus on the Outer Space Treaty and the Liability Convention. So we didn't recommend amendments to be made to these specific treaties because that would be quite impossible given the geopolitical climate. So instead, we wanted to clarify how these treaties basically work with AI systems in space. So first, the launching site definition. with its 4 criteria, it still applies to AI systems, and it actually preserves the liability chain for victims as well. And next, without amending the Outer Space Treaty, we recommend clarifying the term space object through UN COPUS and then UNGA resolutions so that it includes AI integrated systems, both pre and post deployment. And we get a lot of questions about, do we assign personhood to AI and how that would look like? And the issue is that would be extremely complex, and that would open the floodgates to a lot of ethical and legal questions that we simply just don't have the answer to today due to the opaque nature of AI and its continuous development. So that would be premature given the point we are at today. So instead, we affirm that operators are primarily liable, but that liability should follow ownership transfers and extend to developers responsible for post-deployment updates and failures. Next, procurement. So we recommend standardizing AI procurement clauses, first nationally, regionally, then internationally. And procurement is a very important liability tool, and it enables below the state allocation of liability, and it clarifies how responsibility is shared, for example, between operators and developers after the state is held liable on an international level. So the operators will be responsible for mission risks, and developers responsible for design, training, and post-deployment performance. And the key is risk identification mitigation, testing and validation, identification and lifecycle reviews. And when it's time for the international standardization, we propose a government-led procurement forum along with UN COPUS guidelines to harmonize these practices across jurisdiction. And don't worry, this isn't sharing data or IP with other nations, no security issue there. It's just to standardize these specific procurement clauses. Next, ethical considerations. These 3 words, meaningful human control. This is a phrase we hear constantly, yet there's little consensus on what it actually looks like in practice. So it's important to highlight that this is not a comprehensive accountability solution, especially in very fast-paced decision-making and highly autonomous systems. And we highlight this more in great detail when we look at genetic case studies and robotics in our report. But I'll highlight 2 main risks, which is black box AI, where decisions even developers can't explain, and automation bias, where humans overtrust AI decisions. But it's still a very important tool as a basis as more research is done on AI systems. So in the meantime, we propose nations like US could lead in explainable AI for high-risk space applications like collision avoidance and on-orbit servicing, requiring tools like traceability dashboards and tiered oversight, escalating sensitive decisions for human review. And perhaps a cross-agency study on AI under space-specific stressors like radiation and latency could guide standards. And the US could also promote, on an international level, the alignment on AI ethics through organizations like ISO or similar bodies. Next, export controls. So the inconsistent export controls laws make it very difficult to regulate sensitive AI space technologies. And the US could lead in defining AI-specific control lists with clear dual-use criteria and practical risk tools. And at the same time, it's important to highlight that proactive end-use and end-user monitoring, along with exemptions for basic research, could strike the right balance between innovation and security. And in our report, we discuss a bottom-up approach to regulatory alignment, where national policies align with international standards. And as a member of Basnar and Missile Technology Control Regime, the US could advance shared compliance tools such as audits, licensing risk matrices, and technology control plans. Telecommunications. So we have a lot of recommendations for the ITU, but I'll highlight a few. We recommended the creation of an ITU radio communication task force to develop international standards for AI-enabled satellite communications. And also, we recommend that radio regulations be updated to address AI-driven systems, focusing on spectrum allocation, interference management, and automated communication decision-making. And we, as I mentioned, we already presented this to the ITU BR director and his team, and we're going to be in contact with their study team to actually take the next steps. Data protection. Let's move on to this. So AI's reliance on vast data sets often conflict with GDPR norms. But risks such as biases and inaccuracies can be mitigated to a certain level through safeguards like pseudonymization, encryption, and data protection impact assessments, or DPIAs. And we recommend a flexible yet precise definition of necessary data, pre-launch, and periodic reviews of AI-enabled space systems. And this is especially important for high-resolution imagery and other surveillance applications. And these systems should follow data minimization by design, limits on secondary use without formal review, and strong encryption for data at rest and in transit. And we also recommend automated decisions be supported with human oversight, even though we just went over some of its limitations. Things like escalation protocols for edge cases, pause functions in high-risk scenarios, and human-in-the-loop reviews. And the goal here is to co-develop space-specific data protection standards in collaboration with international stakeholders. So let's dive a little bit more into high-resolution imagery. So in our report, we addressed satellite data under data protection, but I'd like to highlight a related concern I explore more deeply in a recent publication of mine, which is high-resolution satellite imagery and its implications for biometric and behavioral analysis. So while frameworks like the EU AI Act classify biometric tracking as high risk, space systems pose unique challenges. And I know most will argue that the Act's classifications could just extend to space, but without clear laws and regulations, courts are limited to reactive enforcement. And by then, the technology may be already embedded in critical infrastructure and very hard to reverse. So the key loophole that I discuss is even if imaging limits exist on board, data can still be analyzed through off-board processing. And that allows for unregulated biometric and behavioral analysis. So I recommend that regulation begin as soon as imagery enables individual or vehicle level identification, and this is especially urgent with companies venturing into VLEO. And I also propose a licensing system for non-military satellites modeled after export control regimes. And these high-risk systems would require risk assessments, time-limited licenses, and default privacy protections such as automatic facial blurring. And unblurring would require a specific license request with clear scope, duration, and audits. But I'd just like to emphasize this is not a blanket rule. Please don't freak out. I'm offering one more licensing requirement, but it would only apply once a certain threshold is crossed. And this would then prevent function creep while keeping process efficient for industry, and that could be done through streamlining licensing renewals for compliant companies and potentially streamlining other licensing requirements. And the thing that I would like to emphasize is the private sector needs to be at the table in helping shape these thresholds and licensing processes to just ensure that they're both effective and operationally viable. And there's also no current international enforcement body on AI in space, and we get asked that question quite a bit. And so I also propose an International Space AI Regulatory Authority, and that would be modeled after International Civil Aviation Organization and International Maritime Organization. And that's why I bring this forward today. And this is not just a technical challenge, but it's a pressing national and foreign policy issue that should be addressed in summits and working groups, bilateral, multilateral dialogues. And I'll give a personal example. The nonprofit I founded, AI Global Solutions, we're actually partnering with satellite companies who provide this imagery. And we are currently trying to access high-resolution imagery, radar, radio frequency, AI to monitor international human and wildlife trafficking hotspots. And we would also partner with government so that we can actually use this data as evidence in courts and then standardize that system. And I know you might be thinking, isn't that kind of counterintuitive that you want to access these technologies and then also put a licensing requirement on them? But as a nonprofit, we support the stronger safeguards. We also discuss the streamlining process. So we want to ensure that it doesn't put a halt on innovation, but still keeps it in a responsible way. And I actually have a new publication coming out this Wednesday, and it's about how space-based technologies like high-resolution satellite imagery can be standardized for use as admissible evidence in both national and international courts. So these frameworks take time to develop, so we must begin now to actually achieve these. Space debris mitigation. Now, the US, powerful nations like the US, could lead the development of technical standards in partnership with ISO and industry, focusing on model explainability, accuracy thresholds, and decision-making protocols. And potentially, the US could host a set of simulation exercises bringing together agencies and international operators with the goal of testing AI-based collision prediction and maneuver planning. And this would then lay the groundwork for shared benchmarks for maneuver precision, fuel efficiency, and alert liability, which would then lead to global standards. And we also discussed oversight models for human-machine systems in space. And that would be like a tiered approach, like a direct control, which is like human-led, divided control or task sharing, and then supervisory control, which is AI-led with human monitoring or intervention. If we do that, then thresholds for human override would also need to be very clearly defined. And then I saved the best for last, space traffic management. So we recommend two pathways, both a decentralized and a centralized approach. I won't spend too much time on the decentralized because, as the name suggests, it's individual nations establishing their own standards based on their needs. And then a centralized approach would be a phased implementation. And that would look like regional and sectoral agreements initially, then standardized data sharing and operational coordination. And in the short term, that would look like enabling bilateral and multilateral data exchange between operators using existing frameworks like global navigation satellite systems and joint authorities for rulemaking on unmanned systems. And over time, we would build SCM standards through ISO or other organizations. And then the long-term goal would be a standalone body called the International Space Traffic Management Authority. Of course, the name can change, but this would be a standalone body modeled after, like I mentioned, ICAO and IMO to oversee SCM operations, AI coordination protocols, and compliance. And of course, both pathways have their benefits and their negative traits. So just in conclusion, actually before I get to the conclusion, this is the QR code if you would like to access our report and read it at length. It will take you to the ISL website where you can download the PDF. So just a few last remarks before I hand it over. Global standardization takes time, and our report includes both short-term and long-term strategies. And it's a proactive approach, it's not reactive. And I just want to emphasize that if we fail to act now, these systems will become so deeply embedded in critical infrastructure that that meaningful regulation may no longer be possible at that point. So with the right balance of innovation and responsibility, AI can enhance, not endanger, the future of space technologies. And the frameworks that we shape today will define the kind of spacefaring nation we choose to become. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuana. We appreciate your remarks and your hard work in this area. We've got a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have a brief question to ask our panelists, please step on up and state your name. We'll do our best to answer your questions.
Okay. Jared Segmiller, U.S. Space Command. As AI systems take on increasingly autonomous roles, as we've been talking about in things like mission planning and satellite operations, maybe even space domain awareness, how should space industry and its regulators approach issues of accountability, decision-making, transparency, and the potential for unintended consequences in the domain where real-time human oversight is often limited? I know we've kind of touched upon this a little bit, but I'd love to deep dive into it a little bit more, so thank you.
Yeah, great question.
I agree with you that some things are premature, but at the same rate, these sorts of regulations, I'm sure all of you know, take a very long time to achieve. So it's also important to take the first steps towards that, to at least lay the groundwork. And AI develops every day. So if we don't have a solid foundation, then we don't really have anything to build off of. And it's going to be much harder to build later than now. And I'll actually give a quick example of that. I always say that we're kind of in a honeymoon phase with these AI technologies. I should trademark that, that's a good phrase. But even though I explained a lot of different ways to set these standards, and I'm sure all of you are looking, they're like, oof, this is geopolitical climate at the moment. I don't know if this is a priority for anyone at this given moment, but it should be. And it's much easier to take the first steps in this honeymoon phase than if we wait, and we have a tendency to do that as a society, wait until the absolute last moment when the problem is just too big to ignore, and then take an action. If we do that, if we kick the can down the road with AI technologies, then we'll be back into a corner, and we will only have defensive options as our next steps, and we'll be fighting on all fronts, and fronts that we don't even know existed. And at that point, I agree with everyone, that will be a very difficult time to start building these frameworks. Because at that point, you're just defensively trying to react to these technologies. So there's a set of urgency in getting in the right mindset to then take the right steps towards this. And that's what I always try to explain with this report as well, that that's a proactive approach to just start the first steps now. And another urgency that I would quickly like to mention is the leadership aspect of it and the international aspect of this. It's the mindset of these powerful nations at the forefront, like the spacefaring nations. And that leadership should look like a collaborative effort because these technologies are very accessible. It concerns every nation in space at this moment. And it's not singling out a few nations with lunar capabilities, for example. This affects everyone. So we have the leadership mindset needs to be to bring these folks to the table and to co-develop these roles. And I know that's easier said than done. Whether we like it or not, we're in this together. And we have to get into that mindset moving forward.
Very good. Next question.
Jackie Waddles with CNN. Kind of a follow-up question, I think, just to help me wrap my brain around all this. Maybe a specific example here. Like we are talking about Starlink's autonomous avoidance maneuvering capabilities. I'm really curious to know, for two different mega constellations operating in orbit, if one has autonomous collision avoidance and the other has a different system, are there any assurances to make sure that these work cooperatively together? Is that a current pressing issue? And what regulatory framework might be necessary to kind of ease any miscommunication there?
I'll just go in the broad scope of things because I actually have a slide on that as well. But space debris mitigation, this is why I keep talking about the international aspect of this, because it concerns more than one nation. And whether we like it or not, these sorts of standardizations, that's what's going to help us get to a point where we don't have to worry about that, and those will be the standards that we follow in industry. And those standards could be done through organizations like the International Standardization Organization that would help develop these technical standards and UNGA guidelines. There are steps like the guidelines, soft laws, that's where its importance comes in, to then later build the standardization, to then afterwards lead to eventually international laws. We can't think in terms of just national. Space is there aren't borders in space. So whether we like it or not, we have to look at it holistically. And I'll just stop there because I can go on forever about this. But
Please join me in thanking Kim, Matt, and Tuana.